The voice echoed in Jin's head, throbbing like a hammer hitting the wall of his mind. It took him a few seconds to realize that the voice was not coming from his mind, but from the old man who was now lying in the middle of the road, his body covered in blood, his eyes widening with inexplicable fear. It rained heavily, drenching Seoul's dark asphalt, creating puddles that reflected the searchlights. Jin blinked, his heart racing. A few hours ago, he just wanted to enjoy the evening after a grueling workout. But now, he stood on the sidewalk, staring at the barely lifeless old man. The man moved his lips once more, barely audible amid the sound of raindrops. "Don't let him find me." Then, in an instant, the man's eyes rolled back, his body convulsed, and something absurd happened. The man disappeared. Jin stepped slowly in the narrow alley, his eyes narrowed through the low-hanging mist. Seoul is never supposed to be quiet, but tonight feels strange. The air is too cold for spring, and something is wrong. Then, he saw an old man, sitting on the sidewalk with his head down. His clothes were disheveled, soaked, as if they had been left there for a long time. Jin stepped closer, feeling that something was urging him to help. "Ajusi, are you okay?" he asked, but the man remained silent. Jin crouched down, shaking his shoulders slightly. When the man looked up, Jin's chest instantly scalded. His face was full of wounds, his eyes were red like someone who had not slept for days. But that's not what made Jin want to retreat. That was the man's expression: fear. Panic. As if seeing Jin alone was a big mistake. Suddenly, the man grabbed Jin's wrist with his unreasonably strong grip. "Run." The new genie will ask when she hears something behind her, footsteps, heavy and dragging, as if someone or something is approaching. Then, in an instant, the old man disappeared. Not leaving, not running away. But it's gone. Like a mist swept away by the wind. And Jin realized one terrible thing. Jin took a step back, his body frozen in the cold of the rain. However, it wasn't because of Seoul's night air, rather something deeper. A fear that sticks to his bones. The shadow did not move. Just standing there, faint, as if his existence wasn't entirely real. But the genie could feel his gaze, even though the figure had no eyes. His voice came back, clearer this time. "You shouldn't have interfered." Instantly, Jin felt pressure on his chest. His heart was beating faster, his breathing was gasping, as if something was squeezing his lungs from the inside. The world around him began to spin, streetlights flickered, and the sounds of the usually bustling Seoul turned into a strange hum. Then, everything went dark. He's not alone anymore. Jin woke up breathless. He was no longer on a street wet with rain, but in a strange place, a narrow room with old wooden walls that creaked every time the wind blew. In front of him, an old woman sat on a rocking wooden chair. He looked at Jin with a blank expression, like someone who already knew everything that was going to happen. "You've seen it," the woman said quietly. "You have to leave before it's too late." Jin frowned. "What do you mean? Who am I looking at?" The woman looked at him with suddenly merciful eyes. "Not who, but what?" Jin felt his neck bristling. "You touch people who shouldn't be in this world." Jin tried to understand what happened, but his head was still throbbing from the previous incident. He remembered the old man who had just disappeared. And then the shadow. The old woman took a deep breath. "The old man you found is no ordinary human being. He should have died years ago." Jin nodded his head. "What you mean?" The woman stared out the window at the rain that was still pouring down on the outside world. "He's being chased by something you can't see. And now, you two are bound to his destiny." Before the genie could ask any further, the wooden door behind her shook violently, as if someone or something was trying to get in. The woman stood up quickly. "He has found you." Jin jumped up from his seat. "Who?" The woman looked at him intently, her expression full of fear. "If you want to survive, you have to run right now." And just then, the wooden door exploded in splinters, and darkness from outside swept in. Jin didn't think. He's just acting. The primitive urge to survive moved his legs, and in an instant, he was already running towards the only way out the window on the side of the room. With the last bit of courage left, he jumped up, the broken glass scattering as his body passed through the frame. The cold air hit his face before gravity pulled him down. Jin crashed into a pile of wetwood in a narrow alley. His body felt like he had been hit by a hammer. However, there is no time to feel pain. From behind the ruins of a wooden house, a crackling sound was heard, like something was moving between the shadows. The genie could feel it, not just see or hear, but feel something invisible approaching her, like a black hole that sucks all the light and life around it. "Run." His voice appeared again, but this time not from that shadow. It was the voice of the old woman just now, almost drowned in the sound of the rain pouring down the city. Without thinking, Jin got up and ran. Jin continued to run until his breath was almost gone. After a few blocks, he found a small alley and leaned against the wall, trying to calm his pounding heart. He checked around. The street looked deserted. There was no sign of the figure following him. However, a strange feeling still lingered, as if there were invisible eyes constantly watching him. A small voice sounded in his ears, almost like a whisper inside his own mind. "Don't believe what you see." Jin looked up quickly. "There's no one." He groaned in frustration. What exactly happened? His eyes caught the image of himself reflected in a puddle on the sidewalk. And just then, the scab stood up, the shadow, not moving along with him. Jin is frozen. He raised his hand. His shadow did not imitate. He tilted his head. His shadow remained still. Then, slowly, the shadow turned to itself and smiled. Jin stepped back with a sigh. It's not real. It can't be real. But before he could process it all, something pulled at his wrist. He gasped, almost screaming, before realizing who was pulling him. An old man. The man who should have disappeared. Jin swallowed, feeling his body tighten. The man was no longer covered in blood as before, but his expression remained the same, panicked, full of fear. "You have to listen to me," the man said, his voice stronger than ever. "Whatever happens, don't follow your own shadow." Jin wanted to ask, wanted to shout, wanted to understand everything. But before he could speak, the man held out something to his hand. An old pocket watch. "It's the only way to keep you alive." And before the genie could ask, the world around her spun. The sound of car horns, the sound of people talking, and the beat of street music again filled the air. It stands on a crowded sidewalk. Soul is back. Old man. There's no shadow. Nothing unusual, but in his hand, the pocket watch was still there. And on its surface, there was an engraving of a name that made his blood freeze. Kim Seekjin. Jin looked at his own name engraved on the clock. His hands began to tremble. And right then, the digital screen in the store next door flickered, showing a news broadcast that made him want to vomit. An elderly man was found dead this morning in Gangnam District. His identity has not been confirmed, however, which is surprising. The camera panned the pocket watch found on the corpse's hand. The clock is identical to the one that is now in the hands of the genie. And even worse, the old man's face was finally shown to the screen. It was his own face. Jin stares at a digital screen displaying news of an elderly man found dead, with a pocket watch identical to the one in his hand. And even more terrible, the old man's face was his own. Jin stood stiffly on the sidewalk, the sound of soul traffic sounding distant, as if echoing from another world. His hand trembled as he squeezed the pocket watch in his hand. No, this is impossible. He raised his gaze to the LED screen above the store, hoping that he had seen wrong. But the face is still there. His own face, old, full of age lines, dead. His blood rippled quickly, cold sweat soaked his temples. Then, something worse happened. His reflection, reflected in the shop's glass display case beside him, did not follow his movements. Jin swallowed, trying to calm his breath. He raised his hand slowly. However, his shadow remained silent. Then, slowly, the shadow turned itself towards him and smiled. Jin jerked backwards, bumping into someone behind him. "Yes. Careful," snapped the man he hit. Before walking away with an upset face, Jin tried to catch his breath. As he turned to the shop glass again, his reflection had returned to normal. It was as if it was just an illusion, but the pocket watch remained in his hands. Proof that all this is real. With trembling hands, Jin opened the lid of the watch. The needle was beating slowly, but there was something strange. The time indicated in it does not run normally. .00:00 over and over. As if the time in the clock was stuck in a circle. Then, a quiet whisper sounded from inside the clock. "You have to find me before time runs out." Jin gasped, almost dropping the clock. That sound didn't just come from inside that thing. That voice is his own voice. Jin began to walk quickly, trying to calm his chaotic mind. Perhaps this is just an illusion due to fatigue. Maybe he needs some sleep. However, as he passed the crossroads, something went wrong. Seoul feels different. People were passing by as usual, but their expressions were blank. Their eyes looked dark, as if there is no life in them. Traffic lights flicker irregularly. The sound of cars, horns, and footsteps sounded a little late, like an echo that came after it should have died. It's as if the whole world is suffering. Then, Gene saw something that made him almost fall down. Across the street, among a crowd of people walking expressionlessly, there is himself, not the old man he saw on the news, except for himself. Right now, Kim Seek-jin. Stand still. Look at him. Gene couldn't think. It's just acting. He ran across the road, ignoring the horn of the car that almost hit him. But as he reached the other side, his other self no longer exists. Gene twisted his body, frantically looking for the figure among the crowd. Then, the voice in his ear whispered again. Time is running out. Out of the corner of his eye, Gene saw something. In the dimly lit old building at the end of the street, between two flashing streetlights, there was an old man standing still. The man looked at her with empty eyes, and the genie knew, deep in her heart, that it was herself in the future. Then, the old man slowly raised his hand, pointing towards something behind Gene. Gene turned around, and right in front of him, the shadow was already standing. The shadow is clearer now. No longer just a faint silhouette, but a figure that looked like him, yet taller, thinner, more empty. Gene took a step back, but the voice whispered right in his ear. You can't run away from your destiny, Kim Seek-jin. Before Gene could react, the world around him changed. Seoul's buildings collapsed like sand, streetlights went out, and everyone disappeared. All that remains is darkness. And the sound of the clock ticking is getting slower. 0.00:00:00:00:00:00. Then, everything turned white. Gene opened his eyes. There is no city, no sound of rain. There are no streets of Seoul full of life. There is only white. It stands in the middle of a void, without direction, without shadow, without gravity that feels real. It was as if the world had been erased, leaving only himself alone in the middle of something he could not comprehend. Then, the voice came again, not a whisper, not an echo, but the ticking of the clock. Tick, tick, tick. Gene is down. The pocket watch was still in his hand. However, now there is something different. The second hand moves backwards. Gene tried to take a step, but his legs felt light, as if walking on air. Every step he took felt the same, like spinning in a circle. Then, something changed. Far in front of him, a silhouette of a person appeared. Gene held his breath. The silhouette was approaching, and more clearly visible. An old man. Himself. Gene backed away, but the old man's voice rang out before he could react. Stop running. We don't have time. Gene gritted his teeth. A feeling of panic crept across his chest. Who are you? Why is your face like mine? The old man let out a long sigh, his expression tired and gloomy. Because I am you. I'm the failed Kim Seek-jin. And if you don't listen to me now, you'll be me. Gene was silent. Something in him knew that this man was not lying. Listen carefully, the old man continued. You're stuck in a loop. You've been through this many times. Always end up here. Always make the same mistake. Gene shook his head, incredulous. What do you mean? I don't remember anything. The old man smiled grimly. Of course not. Every time the loop repeats, your memory is erased. But this time, I managed to contact you before it all started again. Gene felt his head throbbing, like something was trying to come to the fore in his mind, a vague fragment of memory, an inexplicable feeling of déjà vu. I have tried everything to get out, the old man continued. I have died repeatedly. I tried to run. I've tried to fight back. But fate always pulls me back here. Gene looked at the pocket watch in his hand, looking at the needle that was moving backwards. If you don't find a way out before this needle reaches the starting point, you will replace me. You're gonna be me. Gene felt a chill running through his body. And the loop will start again. Gene gulped, his mind working fast. Then how to get out of here? The old man looked at her for a long time before finally answering. You have to find the source. Gene frowned. Source. Creatures that hunt you. The shadow. It's not just a ghost. That is the keeper of this loop. And as long as he is, we will never be free. Gene felt his chest tightness. So I have to face it. The old man finished his sentence. Gene clenched his hands. How? The old man smiled faintly. That's what you have to find out for yourself. Gene was about to ask further, but suddenly, the white world around him began to crack. A terrible sound echoed around them like iron scratched into stone. The old man stiffened. He has found you. Gene felt the ground beneath him tremble. Black cracks crept in the empty air, and from within them, something began to emerge, the shadow. But this time, the form is more real. His eyes lit up red, his body was sturdier, and he was moving at an impossible speed. "Run!" the old man shouted. But before Jin could move, the shadow had already fallen on him. The world is dark again. When Jin opened his eyes, he is back in Seoul. It's raining. Streetlights flashing. And on the sidewalk, an elderly man sits with his head bowed. Jin was stunned. The loop has started again. This time, he had only one chance to get out.